The morning started like any other at Global News Network headquarters in downtown Atlanta. Coffee cups were being filled, phones were ringing, and producers were running around with their usual pre-show energy. But nobody knew that by the end of the day, they would witness one of the most talked-about moments in live television history. Rebecca Chen, the show's executive producer, was dealing with what seemed like a nightmare scenario. Two of her biggest international guests had scheduling conflicts that were threatening to derail the entire evening broadcast. The network had spent weeks arranging these interviews, and now everything was falling apart just hours before going. The first guest was supposed to be the young president of Burkina Faso, a man who had taken power through military means, but had surprised everyone by focusing on economic independence and fighting corruption. At just 34 years old, he had become a symbol of a new generation of African leadership that wasn't afraid to challenge the old ways of doing things. The second interview was with a rising star in American politics, a woman who had built her career on strong foreign policy positions and wasn't shy about expressing her views on how America should deal with other countries. She had requested a separate time slot because she preferred not to share the stage with other political figures, but then disaster struck. The African leader's flight from Paris was delayed by 6 hours due to technical issues. His team called to say he could only make the evening time slot, which was exactly when the American politician was scheduled to appear. Rebecca found herself in an impossible situation. She could cancel one of the interviews, but that would mean disappointing millions of viewers who were expecting to hear from both figures. The network had been promoting these interviews for weeks, and the ratings department was expecting big numbers. Canceling wasn't really an option. That's when she had an idea that seemed crazy but might just work. What if they did a joint interview instead? It would be unprecedented, but it could also be television gold. Two very different political figures from different continents with very different views on how the world should work, sharing the same screen. Rebecca picked up her phone and started making calls. The first call was to the American politicians' team. They were hesitant at first, but when Rebecca explained the situation and mentioned the potential for even higher ratings, they agreed to consider it. The politician herself was confident in her ability to handle any situation, and she saw this as an opportunity to demonstrate her foreign policy expertise on a global stage. The second call was trickier. The African leaders' team was more cautious. They had seen how Western media sometimes portrayed their president, and they weren't sure about sharing the stage with an American political figure. But after some discussion, they agreed, partly because their president had never backed down from a challenge and partly because they saw it as a chance to present their leader's views to a broader audience. With both teams on board, Rebecca's production crew went into overdrive. They had to completely redesign the show's format in just a few hours. The technical team worked on setting up a split-screen arrangement that would allow both guests to appear simultaneously while maintaining good video quality. The research team scrambled to prepare background information on both figures for the host. The host himself, veteran journalist David Rodriguez, was both excited and nervous about the unexpected change. He had interviewed presidents, prime ministers, and world leaders for over 20 years. But this setup was different. He would need to balance the conversation carefully, making sure both guests had equal time while keeping the discussion engaging for viewers. As the afternoon wore on, word began to spread through the newsroom about the unusual arrangement. Younger staff members started gathering around the monitors, sensing that something special might happen. The older, more experienced journalists exchanged knowing looks. They had seen enough live television to know that unexpected moments often produce the most memorable broadcasts. Meanwhile, both guests were preparing in their respective locations. The African leader was in his hotel suite, reviewing briefing materials with his advisors. They discussed potential topics that might come up and how to present their country's positions clearly and confidently. The president himself seemed relaxed, even looking forward to the opportunity to speak directly to an American audience. On the other side of town, the American politician was in her campaign office, also preparing with her team. They went through talking points about foreign aid, international development, and America's role in global affairs. She had appeared on dozens of television shows and felt confident about her ability to articulate her positions effectively. What neither guest knew was that the show's producers had decided to take a more aggressive approach than usual. Instead of the typical softball questions that often characterize diplomatic interviews, they planned to ask more pointed questions about real policy differences. They wanted to create genuine dialogue, not just polite conversation. As evening approached, the energy in the studio began to build. Camera operators checked their equipment one final time. Sound technicians tested the audio levels. The makeup team stood ready to touch up both guests before they went live. Everyone could feel that something big was about to happen. The African leader arrived at the studio first, accompanied by a small team of advisors and security personnel. He was dressed in a simple but elegant suit, and despite the long flight and schedule changes, he appeared alert and ready. Studio staff noted that he seemed genuinely interested in the technical aspects of the broadcast, asking questions about the equipment and the process. The American politician arrived about 30 minutes later, bringing her own team of advisors and communications specialists. She was dressed professionally and carried herself with the confidence of someone who had spent years in the public eye. She briefly reviewed her notes one final time before heading to the makeup chair. As both guests were being prepared, the control room was buzzing with activity. Rebecca watched the monitors carefully, making sure everything was ready. The technical director ran through the shot sequences one more time. The graphics team prepared the lower third identifications for both guests. With 15 minutes until airtime, both guests were brought to the studio. For the first time, they could see each other on the monitors. The African leader nodded politely toward the camera that would show his counterpart. The American politician smiled and waved slightly, maintaining her practiced media demeanor. David Rodriguez took his position at the anchor desk, his earpiece connected to the control room. He could hear Rebecca's voice giving him final instructions and updates. The countdown began, and everyone in the studio fell silent, except for the essential technical personnel. 10 seconds. 5 seconds. The red light on the main camera turned. Good evening and welcome to Global Perspectives. I'm David Rodriguez, and tonight we have a very special broadcast for you. Nobody in that studio, including the host himself, had any idea that they were about to witness television history in the making. The stage was set, the players were in position, and the cameras were rolling. What happened next would be talked about for years to come. The interview started smoothly enough. David Rodriguez opened with his usual professional demeanor, introducing both guests to the audience. The split screen showed the young African president sitting calmly in his chair, while the American politician maintained her polished television smile. For the first few minutes, everything seemed like a standard diplomatic interview. David began with safe questions about recent developments in international relations. The African leader spoke about his country's efforts to build stronger partnerships across the continent. His voice was steady and confident, and he answered each question with the kind of measured responses that veteran politicians are known for. The American politician nodded along, waiting for her turn to speak. When David turned to her, she launched into her prepared talking points about America's commitment to global partnerships and democratic values. Her delivery was smooth and practiced, the result of hundreds of media appearances over the years. She spoke about the importance of international cooperation and how America wanted to support developing nations around the world. But then something shifted in the conversation. David, perhaps sensing an opportunity for more engaging television, decided to dig a little deeper. He asked about specific policies and how they affected different regions of the world. The questions became more pointed, more direct. The American politician seemed to welcome this change. She leaned forward slightly, her voice taking on a more assertive tone. This was her comfort zone, debating policy, making strong statements, showing her expertise on international affairs. She had built her career on these moments. "You know, David," she said, adjusting her position in her chair, "I think it's important for people to understand the reality of the situation in many parts of Africa. We've been providing aid and support for decades, and frankly, the results have been disappointing." The words hung in the air for a moment. In the control room, Rebecca Chen felt her stomach tighten. This wasn't going in the direction they had planned. On the split screen, she could see the African president's expression remain neutral, but something had changed in his posture. He sat a little straighter, his eyes focused more intently on the monitor showing his fellow guest. The American politician continued, gaining momentum. "Look, I'm not trying to be harsh here, but we need to have honest conversations about governance and leadership. Too many countries in that region have struggled with corruption, poor economic management, and political instability. And meanwhile, American taxpayers are expected to keep writing checks." David Rodriguez, sensing the tension building, tried to steer the conversation back to safer ground. But the politician had found her rhythm and wasn't ready to stop. She had made similar comments in smaller settings before, and they had always played well with her base. This was a chance to make the same points to a much larger audience. "I mean, take this recent situation in West Africa," she continued, not naming the African president's country directly, but making it clear what she was referring to. "We have military coups. We have leaders who come to power through force rather than elections, and then they expect the international community to treat them as legitimate partners. That's not how democracy works." The camera operator in the studio noticed the African president's hands, which had been resting casually on the arms of his chair, now gripping them slightly tighter. His face remained composed, but there was an intensity in his eyes that hadn't been there moments before. The American politician was just getting started. She had clearly decided that this was her moment to make a strong statement about American foreign policy and her vision for how the world should work. Her voice grew more confident, more assertive. "And let's talk about economic policy," she said, looking directly into the camera as if speaking to the American people rather than engaging in a dialogue with her fellow guest. "We see countries that reject partnerships with established institutions, that turn away from proven economic models, and then wonder why they can't achieve the kind of growth and prosperity that comes with playing by international rules." In the control room, the tension was becoming palpable. The younger staff members were exchanging glances, unsure of what they were witnessing. The experienced producers knew they were seeing something unusual unfold, but they weren't sure whether it was going to be a disaster or television gold. David Rodriguez was trying to figure out how to handle the situation. He could see that the African president was waiting to respond, but he also knew that cutting off the American politician mid-thought could create its own problems. He decided to let her finish her point and then try to balance the conversation. "What I'm saying," the politician continued, her tone becoming more lecturing, "is that leadership matters. Democratic institutions matter. You can't just change the rules when they don't suit you and expect the rest of the world to go along with it. There are standards of governance that the international community has a right to expect." She paused, for effect, clearly pleased with her statement. In her mind, she had just delivered a masterful summary of American foreign policy principles. She had spoken truth to power, as she often liked to put it. She expected either agreement or perhaps some diplomatic pushback that she could easily handle. What she didn't expect was the look on the African president's face when the camera cut back to him. The neutral diplomatic expression was gone, replaced by something much more intense. His eyes were focused, his jaw set. This wasn't the look of someone who was about to offer a polite diplomatic response. The studio had gone completely quiet, except for the low hum of the equipment. Even the technical crew had stopped their usual quiet movements. Everyone could sense that something significant was about to happen. David Rodriguez cleared his throat and looked toward the monitor showing the African president. "President, I'd like to get your response to those comments. How do you see the relationship between democratic institutions and effective governance in today's world?" The question was diplomatic, designed to give the African leader a chance to respond without directly confronting his fellow guest. But everyone in the room could see that diplomacy was the last thing on the president's mind at that moment. He leaned forward slightly, his hands now clasped together in front of him. When he spoke, his voice was calm but carried an edge that hadn't been there before. "David, that's an interesting question," he said, his accent adding gravity to each word. "But before I answer it, I think I need to address some of the assumptions that have just been made about my continent, my country, and my leadership. The American politician's confident smile faltered slightly. This wasn't the deferential response she had expected. In the control room, Rebecca Chen leaned forward in her chair. The ratings monitor showed viewership spiking as word spread on social media that something dramatic was happening on the broadcast. The African president paused, looking directly into the camera that connected him to his fellow guest. The silence stretched for what felt like an eternity but was probably only a few seconds. Everyone watching could sense that whatever came next was going to change the entire dynamic of the conversation. "I find it fascinating," he finally said, his voice still calm but with an unmistakable undertone of controlled anger. "How easily some people can sit thousands of miles away and make judgments about situations they clearly don't understand." The battle lines had been drawn. What had started as a routine diplomatic interview was about to become something very different. The silence that followed was deafening. In the control room, Rebecca Chen watched as the viewership numbers continued to climb. Social media notifications were pinging constantly on her phone. Something big was happening, and the whole world was starting to pay attention. The African president sat back in his chair, but there was nothing relaxed about his posture. His eyes were locked on the camera, and when he spoke again, his voice carried the authority of someone who had faced down much bigger challenges than a television debate. "Let me tell you something about leadership," he began, his words measured but powerful. "Real leadership isn't about sitting in comfortable offices and making speeches about how other people should run their countries. Real leadership is about getting your hands dirty, making hard choices, and actually solving problems." The American politician tried to interject, but he continued without pause. "You talk about democracy as if it's some kind of magic solution that works the same way everywhere. But let me ask you this. What kind of democracy allows a small group of wealthy people to buy elections? What kind of democracy makes it nearly impossible for ordinary citizens to run for office because they can't afford to compete with corporate money?" David Rodriguez realized he was witnessing something unprecedented. In 20 years of hosting international interviews, he had never seen a world leader speak this directly, this passionately, to an American political figure on live television. The African president's voice grew stronger, more confident. "You mentioned corruption. That's interesting, coming from a country where lobbying is legal, where former politicians become millionaires by selling access to current politicians, where the same companies that fund campaigns somehow always end up winning government contracts." In the studio, the camera operators were doing their best to capture every expression, every gesture. The technical crew had stopped all non-essential movement. Everyone could sense they were witnessing history. And, "You want to lecture me about economic policy?" The president's tone was incredulous now, but still controlled. "Your country prints money whenever it wants, forces other nations to use your currency for trade, and then acts surprised when some of us decide we want to control our own resources." The American politician's face had gone pale. This wasn't the kind of pushback she was used to receiving. In American political debates, there were unspoken rules, certain lines that didn't get crossed. But this man was playing by different rules entirely. "Let me educate you about my country," the president continued, leaning forward slightly. "Before I came to power, our gold was being mined by foreign companies who paid us almost nothing while they made billions. Our people were working in their own mines for wages that couldn't feed their families. And somehow that was considered good governance by your standards." He paused, letting that sink in. The American politician opened her mouth to respond, but he wasn't finished. "We changed that. We took control of our resources. We told those companies that if they want our gold, they need to pay fair prices and treat our workers with respect. And suddenly, we became a military regime that doesn't respect international law." The control room was buzzing with activity. Producers were making calls to network executives, trying to figure out how to handle this unprecedented situation. The legal team was reviewing broadcast standards, making sure they weren't crossing any lines. But the numbers didn't lie. This was becoming the most watched interview in the network's history. You talk about democratic institutions, the president continued, his voice now carrying the full weight of his conviction. But what about the institution of sovereignty? What about the right of a nation to decide its own future without foreign interference, or does democracy only count when it produces the results that benefit your country? The American politician finally found her voice. Look, I think you're misunderstanding. No, he cut her off, his tone sharp but not disrespectful. I understand perfectly. You're upset because we're not playing the game the way you want us to play it. You're upset because instead of begging for aid and loans that come with strings attached, we're finding our own solutions. He gestured toward the camera, as if addressing the American people directly. Your politicians talk about helping Africa, but they never mention that your help usually comes with conditions. Take our loans, but restructure your economy the way we tell you. Accept our aid, but buy your supplies from our companies. That's not help, that's control. The studio was completely silent, except for the hum of the equipment. Even David Rodriguez seemed to have forgotten that he was supposed to be moderating this conversation. Everyone was transfixed by the raw honesty of what they were hearing. And you know what the really interesting part is? The president continued, his voice dropping to a more conversational tone that somehow made his words even more powerful. The same people who lecture us about democracy are the ones who get upset when we actually use democratic principles to make decisions that benefit our people, instead of foreign investors. The American politician tried again. I think there's been a misunderstanding about what I was trying to say. There's no misunderstanding, the president replied firmly. You said exactly what you meant to say. You believe that because your country is powerful, you have the right to judge how other countries should be run. You believe that because your system works for you, everyone else should copy it exactly, even if it doesn't work for their people. He paused, and for a moment his expression softened slightly. But here's what you don't understand. Every country has its own history, its own challenges, its own culture. What works in America might not work in Burkina Faso. What works in Europe might not work in Asia. And the idea that there's only one way to organize a society is not just wrong, it's dangerous. The numbers in the control room showed that they now had viewers from over 50 countries watching the live stream. Social media was exploding with clips and commentary. This wasn't just a television interview anymore. It was a global conversation about power, democracy, and the relationship between nations. You want to know about governance? The president asked, his voice rising slightly. In 3 years, we've built more schools and hospitals than the previous government built in 20 years. We've created jobs, we've improved health care, we've made sure our children can get an education without their families going into debt. And we did it without borrowing money from institutions that would tell us how to spend it. The American politician looked stunned. This wasn't going according to any script she had prepared for. Her usual talking points seemed inadequate in the face of such direct, passionate argumentation. But according to your definition of good governance, the president continued, none of that matters because we didn't follow the exact process that you would have preferred. Well, let me tell you something. Results matter more than process, and our results speak for themselves. He sat back in his chair, but his eyes remained intense, focused. So, before you lecture anyone else about leadership and governance, maybe you should look at your own country. Look at your homeless population, your healthcare system, your education system, your prison system, and then ask yourself if you really have the moral authority to tell other people how to run their societies. The silence that followed was absolute. In that moment, everyone watching knew they had just witnessed something extraordinary, a complete and total dismantling of political assumptions that had gone unchallenged for decades. The silence stretched for what felt like forever. David Rodriguez sat at his anchor desk, momentarily forgetting that he was supposed to be the one guiding this conversation. His earpiece crackled with frantic instructions from the control room. But even the producers seemed unsure how to handle what had just happened. The American politician's face had gone through several shades of red during the president's response. Her media training had prepared her for tough questions, hostile interviews, and political attacks. But nothing had prepared her for this level of direct, intelligent pushback. She looked like someone who had just been hit by a truck she never saw coming. I think there are some points here that need clarification, she stammered, trying to regain her composure. Her usual confident delivery was gone, replaced by the uncertain voice of someone who had clearly lost control of the situation. The African president waited patiently for her to continue, his expression neutral but alert. He had said what he needed to say, and now he was curious to see how she would respond. When I talked about democratic institutions, she continued, her voice still shaky, I wasn't trying to suggest that America doesn't have its own challenges. Of course we do. Every country does. But even as she spoke, everyone could tell that her heart wasn't in it. The words sounded hollow after the passionate, fact-filled response she had just received. She was trying to use her standard political playbook, but it felt inadequate against someone who had just spoken with such raw honesty. In the control room, Rebecca Chen was watching something she had never seen before in all her years in television. The viewership numbers were still climbing. Her phone was buzzing constantly with calls from network executives, other news organizations, and social media managers. The interview was trending worldwide on every major platform. "Ma'am," came a voice through her headset. "We're getting calls. From the State Department." Rebecca's heart skipped a beat. In 20 years of producing international news, she had never had government officials calling during a live broadcast. This was uncharted territory. Meanwhile, the American politician was trying desperately to find her footing. "Look, I think we can all agree that every nation has the right to self-determination. That's not what I was questioning." "Then what exactly were you questioning?" the African president asked quietly. His tone wasn't aggressive, but there was something in his voice that made it clear he wasn't going to let her dodge the issue. The politician paused, realizing she had walked into another trap. If she backtracked too much, she would look weak and inconsistent. But if she doubled down on her original points, she risked another devastating response. "I was talking about the importance of international cooperation and following established protocols for..." She trailed off, clearly struggling to find words that wouldn't get her in more trouble. The confident political figure from the beginning of the interview had been replaced by someone who looked completely out of her depth. David Rodriguez finally found his voice again. "Perhaps we should talk about economic partnerships and how different nations can work together moving forward." It was a lifeline, a chance to move the conversation to safer ground. But the African president wasn't ready to let things go quite yet. "That's an interesting topic, David," he said, his tone remaining calm and measured, "because I think it's important for your viewers to understand what international cooperation has looked like for many African countries over the past 50 years. The American politician's eyes widened slightly. She clearly hoped the worst was over, but it seemed like the president had more to say. "We've been very cooperative," he continued. "We've allowed foreign companies to extract our resources for almost nothing. We've accepted structural adjustment programs that destroyed our local industries. We've welcomed foreign aid that somehow always seemed to benefit the donor countries more than us." His voice remained steady, but there was an undertone of frustration that resonated with viewers around the world. Social media was exploding with comments from people in developing countries who were nodding along with every word. And when we finally said enough and decided to put our people first, suddenly we became uncooperative. Suddenly we weren't following the rules anymore. The control room was in chaos. Phones were ringing constantly. Social media managers were trying to keep up with the flood of comments, shares, and reactions. The legal team was frantically reviewing broadcast standards, but everything the president was saying was factual and delivered without personal attacks. The American politician made one more attempt to regain control. "I think there might be some mischaracterization of American foreign policy here. We've provided billions of dollars in aid to developing countries." The president's response was swift and devastating. "And how much of that aid money actually stayed in those countries? How much went to American contractors, American suppliers, American consultants?" She opened her mouth to respond, but then closed it again. The question hung in the air like a challenge she couldn't meet. "You see," the president continued, "this is exactly what I'm talking about. You frame everything in terms of what you've given, never what you've taken. You never mention the resources that left our countries, the profits that went to foreign shareholders, the debt payments that consumed our budgets for decades. By now, the interview had completely transformed from its original format. What started as a polite diplomatic conversation had become a masterclass in how global power dynamics actually work. Viewers around the world were getting an education they had never expected from a television interview. The American politician looked around desperately, as if hoping someone would rescue her from this situation. But David Rodriguez was too fascinated by what he was witnessing to interrupt, and her own team was probably watching in horror from wherever they were. "I think," she said weakly, "we might have different perspectives on these issues." It was a surrender disguised as diplomacy, and everyone watching knew it. The confident political figure who had started the interview lecturing about governance and democracy had been reduced to admitting that maybe she didn't have all the answers. After all, the African president nodded slowly. "Yes, we do have different perspectives, and that's exactly my point. Your perspective comes from a position of power and privilege. Mine comes from a position of having to fight for every bit of dignity and respect my country gets on the world stage." The studio fell silent again. The weight of his words seemed to fill the entire space. Camera operators who had been doing this job for years later said they had never felt such intensity during a live broadcast. Social media was on fire. Clips of the exchange were being shared millions of times. News organizations around the world were scrambling to cover what was happening. Political analysts were being pulled into emergency meetings to discuss the implications of what they had just witnessed. In embassies and government offices across multiple continents, phones were ringing as officials tried to figure out how to respond to this unprecedented moment of diplomatic honesty on live television. The interview still had a few minutes left, but everyone knew that nothing else that happened would matter. The damage had been done, or the truth had been told, depending on your perspective. The confident American politician had been systematically dismantled by someone she had clearly underestimated, and the whole world had watched it happen in real time. The interview ended with David Rodriguez doing his best to wrap things up professionally, but everyone could tell that the normal closing remarks felt completely out of place after what had just happened. As soon as the cameras stopped rolling, the studio erupted into controlled chaos. Rebecca Chen rushed down from the control room, her phone still buzzing with calls from network executives. She had been in television long enough to know when something big had happened, but this felt different from anything she had experienced before. The viewership numbers were unlike anything the network had ever seen for an international interview. The American politician sat in her chair for a moment after the cameras stopped, looking like someone who was still trying to process what had just happened to her. Her team of advisors quickly surrounded her, speaking in hushed, urgent tones. One of them was already on the phone, probably doing damage control with the media. Meanwhile, the African president seemed remarkably calm for someone who had just delivered one of the most talked-about television performances in recent memory. He thanked the technical crew, shook hands with David Rodriguez, and walked out of the studio with the same quiet confidence he had brought in. But the real story was just beginning to unfold online. Within an hour of the interview ending, clips were everywhere. The exchange had been cut into dozens of short videos, each highlighting different moments from the confrontation. Social media platforms were struggling to keep up with the volume of shares, comments, and reactions. The most popular clip, which would eventually be watched over 50 million times, was the moment when the president asked about democracy and corporate money. The second most popular was his response about economic cooperation and foreign aid, but people were sharing every part of his response, dissecting every word, every pause, every gesture. The reaction was unlike anything anyone had seen before. In African countries, people were sharing the clips with pride, finally seeing one of their leaders speak truth to power on a global stage. Students in universities across the continent organized viewing parties to watch the full interview together. In America, the reaction was more mixed but equally intense. Some people were angry, calling the president disrespectful and ungrateful, but others were sharing the clips with comments like, "He's not wrong," and "Someone finally said it." The political divide that seemed to affect every issue in American Politics was playing out in real time over this interview. But it wasn't just Americans and Africans who were paying attention. The interview was being shared in dozens of languages across every continent. People in Latin America, Asia, and the Middle East were nodding along with the president's words, recognizing their own experiences in his descriptions of international relations. News organizations around the world scrambled to provide analysis and context. Political experts were pulled into emergency appearances to discuss what they had just witnessed. But many of them seemed as surprised as everyone else by the directness and effectiveness of the president's response. The American politicians team went into full crisis mode. They released a statement within hours, trying to clarify her comments and emphasize her respect for all nations and their sovereignty. But the statement felt weak compared to the power of what people had just watched. Her scheduled appearances for the rest of the week were quietly canceled. Campaign advisors held emergency meetings to figure out how to handle the fallout. The politician herself largely disappeared from public view for several days, a stark contrast to her usual media presence. Meanwhile, the African president's approval ratings at home soared to levels that political scientists said they had never seen before. Videos of people across his country celebrating in the streets began appearing online. Citizens who had sometimes questioned his methods were now praising him for defending their nation's dignity on the world stage. But the impact went far beyond just two political figures. Universities began incorporating the interview into their international relations courses. Students were assigned to analyze the exchange, to break down the arguments, to discuss the broader implications for global politics. Professors noted that it was rare to find such a clear example of how power dynamics actually work in international relations. The interview also sparked broader conversations about media representation. Journalists began examining how they approached interviews with leaders from developing countries. Some admitted that they had unconsciously adopted certain assumptions about who deserved respect and who could be challenged more aggressively. International news networks started changing their approach to diplomatic interviews. Producers realized that their audiences were hungry for more honest, substantive conversations rather than the polite diplomatic language that usually characterized such programs. The economic arguments that the president had made also gained traction in academic circles. Economists began writing papers analyzing his points about foreign aid, resource extraction, and international lending. Several major universities organized conferences to discuss alternative approaches to international development. 6 months. After the interview, a major American newspaper ran a detailed investigation into foreign aid spending that largely confirmed many of the president's claims. The investigation found that a significant portion of aid money did indeed flow back to American companies and contractors, just as he had suggested. The American politician's career took a significant hit. Her poll numbers dropped dramatically, and several major donors quietly distanced themselves from her campaigns. She eventually took a position at a think tank, largely stepping back from public political life. But perhaps the most significant long-term impact was on how other world leaders approached their interactions with Western media and politicians. The interview had shown that it was possible to push back against condescending treatment without being disrespectful or unprofessional. Other African leaders began adopting similar approaches in their international appearances. Leaders from other developing regions took note as well. The era of quietly accepting lectures about governance and democracy began to give way to more assertive defenses of national sovereignty. A year later, at a major international summit, several world leaders referenced the interview when discussing the need for more equal partnerships between nations. The phrase mutual respect began appearing more frequently in diplomatic communications. The interview also had an unexpected impact on American political discourse. Some politicians began acknowledging the valid points that had been raised about American foreign policy. Others doubled down on traditional approaches, but they found themselves having to defend positions that had previously gone unchallenged. Young Americans, particularly those in college, began asking more questions about their country's role in international affairs. International relations programs saw increased enrollment, as students wanted to better understand the complex dynamics that the interview had exposed. The African president himself used the momentum from the interview to strengthen partnerships with other developing nations. His direct, honest communication style had gained him respect on the international stage, and he leveraged that respect to build new economic and political alliances. 5 years later, journalism schools were still using the interview as a case study in how a single moment of television could shift global conversations. Media analysts noted that it had marked a turning point in how international news was covered and how world leaders interacted with each other in public forums. The interview had lasted less than an hour, but its impact would be felt for years to come. It had shown that when someone speaks truth with intelligence, passion, and dignity, the whole world stops to listen.